March 15, 2024. The morning air in Millbrook, Oregon hung thick with the promise of rain. For construction foreman Jake Mitchell, it was supposed to be just another day on the job, breaking ground on what would become the town's first shopping center in decades. The property had sat abandoned for nearly 10 years, a crumbling farmhouse on 20 acres that locals had long whispered about, a place where tragedy had written itself into the very foundation. Jake's excavator bit into the earth with mechanical precision, scooping away layers of soil that hadn't seen daylight in generations. 10 feet down, 12 feet, 15 feet, and then resistance. Not rock, not clay, something else entirely. Hold up. Jake's voice cracked over the radio to his crew. We've got something. What the excavator had struck wasn't natural. It was concrete. A massive slab of it, buried deep beneath what had once been the master bedroom of the old Patterson house. As the crew carefully cleared away the surrounding earth, the shape became clear. A reinforced concrete structure, deliberately hidden, deliberately built to last. Jake Mitchell had been in construction for 23 years. He'd seen foundation remnants, old wells, even forgotten storm shelters. But this was different. The concrete was too thick, too intentional. And there, along one edge, barely visible beneath decades of soil, a seam, a door. By 10:47 a.m., the Millbrook Police Department had established a perimeter. By noon, the Oregon State Police had arrived. By 2 p.m., Detective Sarah Morrison stood at the edge of the excavation site, staring down at what her team had just uncovered, and felt the bottom drop out of her world. How many, she asked the forensic technician, though she could already see the answer in his ashen face. 4, he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. 4 sets of remains. Children, by the size of them. They've been down there a long time. Detective Morrison had been with the state police for 30 years. She'd worked homicides, missing persons, cold cases that would make most people lose sleep for weeks. But standing there, looking down at those small skeletal remains arranged in what had clearly been beds, she felt something she rarely allowed herself to feel on the job. Pure, overwhelming grief. Because even before the dental records came back, even before the forensic anthropologist made the official identification, Sarah Morrison knew exactly who these children were. Everyone in Millbrook over the age of 40 knew. These were the Patterson children. Michael, Sarah, Danny, and Emma. The 4 siblings who had vanished without a trace on October 14, 1986, in what had become one of Oregon's most haunting unsolved mysteries. But it was what else the forensic team found in that underground chamber that would change everything anyone thought they knew about this case. As they carefully documented the scene, the evidence painted a picture that made no sense, until suddenly, horrifyingly, it did. The chamber wasn't just a burial site. It was a shelter, a prison, a tomb built by loving hands with the worst of intentions. This is the story of 4 children who disappeared in 1986, and the devastating truth that took 38 years to uncover. This is the story of how evil can wear the face of protection, and how love can become the most dangerous weapon of all. If you're drawn to true crime stories that uncover the darkest corners of human nature, subscribe to Ultimate Crime Stories. We dive deep into cases that will keep you up at night, searching for answers in the shadows. Hit that subscribe button now, because this story is just beginning, and what comes next will challenge everything you think you know about this case. The identification process moved with unusual speed, driven by the haunting possibility that everyone in Millbrook already suspected. Dental records for the Patterson children had been kept meticulously in the case file, updated periodically over the years by investigators who never quite gave up hope that they might be needed one day. On March 17, 2024, just 2 days after the discovery, the medical examiner delivered the official confirmation that sent shockwaves through the community and, within hours, through the entire nation. The remains belonged to Michael Patterson, age 15 at the time of death. Sarah Patterson, 12. Daniel Patterson, 9. And Emma Patterson, just 6 years old when she drew her last breath in that concrete tomb. Detective Morrison held the press conference on the steps of the Millbrook courthouse. She was a professional, seasoned by decades of delivering bad news to families waiting for closure. But this was different. There was no family left to notify. The Patterson parents, Robert and Linda, had been found dead in their bed on October 15, 1986, the day after their children disappeared, which meant that for 38 years, the people of Millbrook had mourned for missing children while walking past their grave, never knowing they were buried just 15 feet beneath the earth they stood on. Today we can confirm what many in this community have long feared, Detective Morrison said, her voice steady, but her eyes betraying the weight of the moment. The remains discovered on March 15th have been positively identified as Michael, Sarah, Daniel, and Emma Patterson. After 38 years, these children are finally coming home. The questions from reporters came in a flood. How did they die? How long had they been there? Why hadn't they been found during the original investigation? Each question Morrison deflected with the same response. The investigation was ongoing. More information would be released as it became available. But she couldn't deflect the one question that hung in the air, unspoken but deafening in its implications. What kind of monster buries 4 children in an underground chamber and lets the world spend decades searching for them? The answer, when it finally came, would be far more complicated and far more tragic than anyone could have imagined. As news of the identification spread, Millbrook transformed into a town in mourning all over again. The Patterson case had been the defining tragedy of a generation, the story that parents whispered about when they held their own children a little tighter, the cautionary tale that had no moral because it had no explanation. For 38 years, people had theorized, investigated, and imagined what might have happened to those 4 children. Some believed they'd been abducted and taken far away, perhaps still alive somewhere under assumed names. Others thought they'd met a quick and terrible end, their bodies hidden in the vast forests of the Pacific Northwest. A few optimists even held onto the hope that they'd run away together and built new lives somewhere beyond the reach of the tragedy that had consumed their parents. Now, the truth was emerging from the earth like a confession too long buried. And it was worse than any of the theories because it was so close. The children had never left. They'd been there all along, trapped beneath the very house where searchers had walked, where investigators had combed for clues, where subsequent families had lived and slept, never knowing that just below their feet lay the answer to Millbrook's greatest mystery. The preliminary findings from the medical examiner added another layer of horror to an already unbearable situation. The chamber where the children were found wasn't just a hole in the ground. It was engineered, 12 feet by 20 feet, with concrete walls 2 feet thick, reinforced ceiling, evidence of a ventilation system, though the mechanism had long since corroded away. Shelving units along the walls that had once held supplies, canned goods with labels dating to the mid-1980s, containers that had once held water, blankets that had deteriorated into moldy fragments. And the beds. 4 small beds arranged along one wall. The children had been found in those beds, their skeletal remains still lying where they had drawn their final breaths decades ago. What I can tell you, the medical examiner stated in his report, choosing his words with the careful precision of someone who understood the weight they carried, is that this chamber was designed to sustain life. Whoever built it intended for people to survive down there for an extended period. The ventilation system, the food storage, the water containers. These were all elements of a functional survival shelter. But something went wrong. Catastrophically wrong. The question that burned in everyone's mind was simple. Why? Why would someone build an underground chamber designed to keep children alive, only to seal them inside and let them die? To answer that question, we need to go back. Back to 1986. Back to a crisp October morning when the Patterson family seemed, to all outside observers, to be living the American dream. Back to the last day anyone saw Michael, Sarah, Danny, and Emma alive. Autumn in Millbrook, Oregon in 1986 was the kind of season that belonged on a postcard. The maple trees that lined Main Street blazed in shades of red and gold. The air carried the sweet scent of wood smoke from fireplaces being lit for the first time since spring. It was a town of 3,200 people where everyone knew everyone, where doors were rarely locked, where children still rode their bikes until the streetlights came on. The Patterson family had lived in Millbrook for 6 years by the fall of 1986, having moved to the area in 1980. Robert Patterson owned and operated Patterson Hardware on Main Street, a business that had become something of a community hub. Farmers came in for supplies and stayed to chat. Homeowners came in for advice and left with exactly what they needed, along with Robert's patient instructions on how to use it. He was 42 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of steady competence that made people trust him with their projects and their problems. His wife, Linda, taught second grade at Millbrook Elementary. At 39, she was beloved by her students and respected by her colleagues. She had a gentle way about her, a soft voice that could somehow quiet a rowdy classroom with just a word. Parents requested her specifically for their children. Other teachers sought her advice. She seemed to embody everything good about small-town teaching, patience, dedication, and a genuine love for watching young minds grow. Their children were, by all accounts, wonderful kids. Michael, at 15, was quiet and studious, the kind of teenager who helped elderly neighbors with yard work without being asked. He played clarinet in the school band and had recently expressed interest in becoming an engineer. Sarah, 12, was artistic and thoughtful, always with a sketchbook tucked under her arm. She drew everything: the town, her family, the changing seasons. Her art teacher said she had real talent, the kind that could take her far if she wanted to pursue it. Danny, 9, was the athlete of the family. He played Little League baseball and was, according to his coach, one of the most naturally talented kids to come through the program in years. He had a throwing arm that could make the ball sing and a smile that could light up a room. And Emma, 6 years old and in her mother's second grade class, was the baby of the family. She had her mother's gentle nature and her father's steady determination. She was learning to read, and according to Linda, she was exceeding all expectations. The Patterson home sat on 20 acres about 3 miles outside of town, far enough for privacy, close enough to still feel connected to the community. It was a large farmhouse, white with dark green shutters, built in the 1920s and renovated extensively after the Pattersons purchased it. There was a big front porch where Linda liked to sit and grade papers in the afternoon. A tire swing hung from an old oak tree in the front yard. In the back, Robert had built a workshop where he tinkered with furniture projects on weekends. To their neighbors, the Pattersons seemed like the ideal family. Hardworking, kind, devoted to each other and their children. If there were any problems behind the white picket fence, they weren't visible to the outside world. But looking back, after everything that happened, some people would remember small details that seemed strange in retrospect. The way the Patterson children were never involved in sleepovers or playdates at friends' houses, though they occasionally had friends over to their place. The way Linda sometimes seemed tired, worn down by something more than just the normal exhaustion of teaching and parenting. The way Robert could sometimes be seen working on his property late at night, the sound of construction echoing across the fields long after sunset. Most notably, several teachers at Millbrook Elementary would later recall that the Patterson children, despite being well-behaved and academically successful, sometimes seemed exhausted. They would occasionally fall asleep during class. They sometimes had dark circles under their eyes, as if they hadn't slept well. When asked about it, they always had explanations, stayed up late reading, had bad dreams, heard coyotes outside their window. Nothing that raised serious red flags. Nothing that seemed, at the time, to warrant concern. In 1986, people didn't look for monsters in families like the Pattersons. They looked for them in strangers, in outsiders, in people who didn't fit the comfortable image of small-town America. The idea that something dark could be brewing in that white farmhouse with the tire swing and the flower boxes would have seemed absurd. Until October 14th, when the impossible became undeniable. October 14th, 1986, was a Tuesday. The weather was unseasonably warm, one of those surprise gifts that autumn sometimes offers before winter arrives. The morning bell rang at Millbrook Elementary at 8:15 a.m., and by 8:30, teachers were taking attendance in their homeroom classes. Sarah Patterson wasn't in Mrs. Hendrick's 7th grade homeroom. Danny Patterson wasn't in Mr. Chen's 4th grade class. Emma Patterson wasn't in her mother's 2nd grade classroom, which was particularly unusual because Linda Patterson wasn't there either. Michael Patterson, a sophomore at Millbrook High School, was also absent from his first period algebra class. For most families, a day of absence wouldn't raise immediate alarms. Kids get sick. Parents keep them home. It happens. But the Patterson children had perfect attendance records. Perfect. In 6 years at Millbrook schools, none of them had missed a single day for illness. They'd been present for every parent-teacher conference, every school event, every normal Tuesday. By 10 a.m., Principal Margaret Walsh at Millbrook Elementary had tried calling the Patterson home 3 times. No answer. She sent someone to check Robert's hardware store. The closed sign hung in the window, which was unusual for a Tuesday morning, but not unprecedented. Maybe they'd gone on an unexpected trip. Maybe there was a family emergency. But something about it felt wrong to Principal Walsh. She couldn't articulate why. It was just a feeling, a small, uncomfortable itch at the back of her mind. Linda Patterson wasn't the type to miss work without calling. In 8 years of teaching at Millbrook Elementary, she'd never been absent without notice. Not once. By 2 p.m., Principal Walsh's uncomfortable feeling had grown into genuine concern. She asked Janet Morrison, a 3rd grade teacher and Linda's close friend, to drive out to the Patterson house and check on the family. Janet Morrison would later say that the 20-minute drive to the Patterson property felt longer than it should have. She kept telling herself she was being silly, that there was probably a perfectly reasonable explanation. Maybe they'd all gotten food poisoning. Maybe Linda's phone was out of order, and she'd been too sick to drive to town and let anyone know. These things happened. But when Janet pulled into the Patterson driveway at 2:37 p.m., the feeling that something was terribly wrong became inescapable. Both family cars were in the driveway, Robert's blue pickup truck and Linda's tan station wagon. The house looked normal from the outside. Quiet, but normal. No signs of disturbance. The flowers in Linda's window boxes were slightly wilted, which was odd because Linda was meticulous about watering them. The front door was closed, but Janet would discover when she knocked and got no answer, it was unlocked. Linda. Janet called out as she pushed the door open. Robert? It's Janet Morrison from the school. Is everything okay? Silence. Complete and total silence. The interior of the house looked lived in. That's the phrase Janet would use later when giving her statement to police. It looked like people had just stepped away for a moment. There were breakfast dishes still on the kitchen table, 4 bowls with dried cereal stuck to the bottom, 2 coffee mugs with a film of cold coffee in them. The morning newspaper, dated October 14th, lay open to the comics section on the kitchen counter. In the living room, the television was still on, displaying the afternoon soap opera that Linda sometimes watched while grading papers. The volume was low, and the actors played out their dramas to an empty room. Janet walked through the first floor, calling out names, her voice growing more anxious with each unanswered call. She climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor. 4 bedroom doors stood open, Michael's room with its posters of rock bands and model airplanes, Sarah's room with drawings tacked to every available surface, Danny's room with baseball trophies on the shelf, Emma's room with stuffed animals arranged carefully on her bed. The beds were all made. Backpacks sat by the doors, ready for school. It was as if the children had prepared for a normal Tuesday morning and then simply vanished. But it was the master bedroom that made Janet Morrison's hands shake as she reached for the phone to call the police. The door was closed, and when she tried the handle, she found it locked. From the inside. Robert? Linda. She knocked hard, her heart pounding. Are you in there? It's Janet. I need to know you're okay. Nothing. No sound. No response. Janet Morrison ran back downstairs and called 911 at 2:52 p.m. The Millbrook Police Department, all 8 officers of it, responded within 15 minutes. When Sheriff Thomas Davies arrived at the Patterson house at 3:07 p.m., he found Janet Morrison sitting on the front porch, pale and shaking. He'd been sheriff of Millbrook for 12 years, and he'd known the Patterson family since they'd moved to town. Robert had helped him remodel his kitchen just the previous summer. Linda had taught his youngest daughter to read. "The master bedroom door is locked from the inside," Janet told him, her voice trembling. "And Tom, I don't think anyone's in there. I stood outside that door for 10 minutes before you got here. I didn't hear breathing. I didn't hear anything." Sheriff Davies climbed the stairs with 2 of his deputies. He knocked on the master bedroom door, identified himself, demanded a response. When none came, he made the decision to break it down. What they found when the door splintered open would haunt Thomas Davies for the rest of his life. Robert and Linda Patterson lay in their bed, still in their nightclothes, their bodies positioned as if they were sleeping. But they weren't sleeping. They were dead, had been dead for hours, based on the room temperature and the state of the bodies. There were no signs of violence, no blood, no trauma, just 2 people who looked like they'd gone to sleep and never woken up. On the nightstand between them sat 2 empty bottles of prescription medication, powerful sedatives, and a half-empty bottle of whiskey. But in that moment, standing in the Patterson master bedroom, Sheriff Davies wasn't primarily concerned with how Robert and Linda had died. That question would be answered by the medical examiner. What consumed his thoughts, what sent ice water through his veins, was a different question entirely. Where were the children? Because Michael, Sarah, Danny, and Emma Patterson were nowhere in that house. Their beds were made, but empty. Their backpacks were packed, but going nowhere. They had simply disappeared, as if the earth had swallowed them whole. Within an hour, the Patterson property was swarming with law enforcement. Within 2 hours, volunteers from Millbrook were organizing search parties. Within 4 hours, the FBI had been notified. And within 24 hours, the disappearance of the Patterson children had become national news. The search for the Patterson children was, at the time, the largest mobilization of volunteers in Oregon history. More than 500 people descended on Millbrook in the days following the discovery of Robert and Linda's bodies. They came from all over the state, fellow teachers, concerned parents, church groups, Boy Scout troops, retired law enforcement officers. They came because 4 children were missing, and because in 1986, in a small town like Millbrook, that meant something. It meant everyone dropped everything and searched. The search was methodical and massive. Volunteers formed lines and walked shoulder to shoulder through the 20 acres of the Patterson property and the surrounding woods. Every shed, every outbuilding, every possible hiding place was checked, rechecked, and documented. 9 units were brought in from 3 different counties. The dogs picked up the children's scents, following them from the house to various points on the property. But every trail ended at the property line, as if the children had simply evaporated. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras flew grid patterns over the area. Divers searched the creek that ran through the back portion of the Patterson property and every pond within a 5-mile radius. Volunteers checked every abandoned building, every hunting cabin, every place where frightened children might have run to hide. The FBI established a command center in Millbrook's community center. Special Agent Richard Foster, who had worked dozens of child abduction cases, led the investigation. He brought in forensic experts, profilers, and specialists in missing children cases. They set up a hotline for tips. They plastered the children's photos on every television station from Seattle to Sacramento. Missing persons posters went up in every truck stop, grocery store, and gas station in the Pacific Northwest. The working theory in those first crucial days was that the children had either run away after finding their parents dead or had been abducted by an unknown party. The idea that Robert and Linda themselves might have been responsible for the children's disappearance was considered, but seemed to have a fatal flaw. If they'd killed their children, where were the bodies? Ground-penetrating radar units were brought in to scan the Patterson property. They found nothing. Cadaver dogs were deployed. They alerted on nothing. The concrete slab that would, 38 years later, yield its terrible secret went undetected, buried too deep and hidden too well beneath what had been the master bedroom floor. As days turned into weeks, the desperate energy of the search began to give way to a grim determination. The volunteers didn't stop, but the hope that had initially driven them began to fade. People started using the past tense when talking about the children. Michael was such a sweet boy. Sarah loved to draw. The shift in language was subtle but telling. The investigation into Robert and Linda's deaths concluded quickly. The toxicology reports showed lethal levels of sedatives in both bodies, combined with alcohol. The pills were Robert's prescription. He'd been taking them for back pain after an injury at the hardware store. But the amount they consumed, the way they'd taken them together, the timing coinciding with their children's disappearance, it all pointed to a deliberate act. The medical examiner ruled the deaths a double suicide. But suicide raised more questions than it answered. People who commit suicide, particularly parents, often leave notes explaining their actions. Robert and Linda left nothing. No explanation. No goodbye. No clue as to what had driven them to such a desperate act or what had happened to their children. As the search stretched into November, the weather turned. Rain came, then snow. The physical search was scaled back, though law enforcement continued to pursue every lead, every theory, every desperate hope. By Christmas 1986, the Patterson case had evolved from a massive search and rescue operation into a cold case. For children, vanished without a trace. 2 parents, dead by their own hands for reasons no one could fathom. Theories abounded in the absence of answers. Some believed that Robert and Linda had killed their children in a murder-suicide gone partially awry, perhaps planning to die with them, but unable to go through with the murder portion. But again, where were the bodies? Others theorized that the children had been abducted, that Robert and Linda had been killed by the abductor, or had killed themselves out of grief. But there was no evidence of any third party on the property, no ransom demand, no suspects. The darkest theory, whispered in hushed tones, was that Robert and Linda had been involved in something terrible, something that had required them to make their children disappear. But what could possibly drive parents to such an extreme? And if they'd sent the children away or hidden them somewhere, why hadn't the children been found? The case file grew thick with dead ends and false leads. Every few months, someone would report seeing the Patterson children at a rest stop in California, in a shopping mall in Washington, at a county fair in Idaho. Every lead was investigated. Every one led nowhere. Michael's 15th birthday passed. Then his 16th. Sarah turned 13 without a celebration. Danny's 10th birthday came and went. Emma, who had been 6 when she disappeared, would have started 3rd grade, then 4th, then 5th. The children existed in a strange temporal limbo, frozen at the ages they'd been when they vanished, while simultaneously growing older in everyone's imagination. As the immediate search for the Patterson children wound down, the investigation into why they'd disappeared intensified. If the children couldn't be found, perhaps understanding their parents could provide answers. The FBI began a deep dive into Robert and Linda Patterson's lives, and what they uncovered was far more complex than the simple small-town family they'd appeared to be. Robert Patterson's hardware store, which had seemed modestly successful, was actually extraordinarily profitable. Far more so than a small-town hardware store in a community of 3,200 people should have been. Bank records showed regular large cash deposits that couldn't be fully explained by the store's retail receipts. When investigators pressed Robert's business partner, Marcus Webb, about the source of this extra income, Webb seemed genuinely surprised. He handled the retail operations. Robert handled the books and finances. Webb had assumed the extra money came from contractor accounts or bulk sales. But when investigators followed those trails, the numbers didn't add up. Where was Robert Patterson getting this money? The question became more urgent when investigators discovered that Robert had purchased the 20-acre property in 1980 for cash, $85,000 in 1980 dollars, an enormous sum that should have been beyond the means of a hardware store owner who'd only been in business for a few months. But it was Linda Patterson's background that proved to be the real revelation, and the one that would ultimately break the case wide open decades later. Linda Patterson, according to her Oregon teaching credentials and employment records, had been born Linda Morrison in Wisconsin in 1947. She'd received her teaching degree from the University of Wisconsin in 1969. She taught in Wisconsin until 1975, when she'd moved to Oregon and eventually settled in Millbrook in 1980, the same year she married Robert. But when FBI investigators requested Linda's records from Wisconsin, they hit a wall. There were records for a Linda Morrison who matched the basic details: birth year, teaching degree, early employment history. But something didn't track. The Linda Morrison in the Wisconsin records had gone missing in 1974. Her entire family, parents, 2 siblings, and Linda herself, had died in a house fire in Madison, Wisconsin in December 1974. The fire had been ruled arson. No suspects were ever identified. Case closed, entire family dead. Except Linda Morrison wasn't dead. She'd been living in Oregon under her maiden name, teaching 2nd grade, raising 4 children with a man she'd married in 1980. The FBI ran the fingerprints from Linda's teaching credentials. They matched the fingerprints on file for Linda Morrison from Wisconsin. Same person. But if Linda Morrison had supposedly died in 1974, who was the woman in the Patterson bed in 1986? The answer came from a deep dive into Wisconsin criminal records from the early 1970s. In 1973, Linda Morrison had been a witness in a federal case against a man named Vincent Caruso. Caruso was connected to organized crime, running operations out of Chicago with tentacles reaching into Wisconsin. The case involved racketeering, extortion, and murder. Linda Morrison had witnessed something, exactly what was redacted in the files, sealed by court order. But her testimony was considered crucial to the prosecution. The case never went to trial. Vincent Caruso's attorney successfully argued for dismissal on a technicality. The witnesses, including Linda Morrison, were released from their obligations. But people who testified against Vincent Caruso, or even prepared to testify, had a way of meeting unfortunate ends. The FBI had recommended that Linda enter witness protection. According to the files, she'd refused. Less than a year after the Caruso case was dismissed, Linda Morrison's family was killed in that house fire. The arson investigation went nowhere, but the timing was impossible to ignore. The FBI suspected it was retaliation for Linda's cooperation with federal investigators, possibly a message from Caruso's organization. But they couldn't prove it, and Linda Morrison had vanished. Now, 12 years later, the FBI understood. Linda hadn't died in that fire. She'd run. She'd created a new identity, not through witness protection, but through her own desperate measures. She'd fled Wisconsin, moved to Oregon, and eventually met Robert Patterson. They'd married, bought property, started a family, and built what appeared to be a perfectly normal life in a perfectly normal small town. But Vincent Caruso hadn't forgotten. Men like Caruso never forgot. In October 1986, Caruso was still alive and still operating his criminal enterprise. When FBI agents contacted him in connection with the Patterson investigation, his lawyer immediately shut down all questions. Caruso provided an alibi for October 14, 1986. He'd been in Chicago, surrounded by witnesses. He expressed surprise and feigned sadness about the tragic deaths in Oregon, claimed he'd never heard of the Pattersons, and denied any knowledge of Linda Morrison's whereabouts over the past decade. The FBI couldn't touch him. There was no evidence connecting him to the Patterson case. No proof he'd even known where Linda was. It was all theory, all supposition, all educated guesses based on patterns and histories. But to investigators, particularly to Special Agent Richard Foster, the picture was becoming clearer. Robert and Linda Patterson hadn't committed suicide for no reason. They'd been running from something. And in October 1986, whatever they'd been running from had caught up with them. The question was, what had they done with their children? Had they sent them into hiding? Had they given them to someone they trusted? Or had they done something far worse? Without bodies, without evidence, without any trace of where the children had gone, the investigation ground to a halt. The case remained open, but active investigation ceased. Over the years, it would be reviewed periodically, particularly when new forensic techniques became available. DNA databases were checked when they became widespread in the 1990s. Age-progressed photos of the children were created and distributed in 2000, showing what Michael, Sarah, Danny, and Emma might look like as adults. None of it yielded results. The Patterson children remained ghosts, trapped in 1986, frozen at ages 15, 12, 9, and 6 forever. Time has a strange quality in cases like this. For most people, for the world at large, the Patterson case faded from immediate memory within a few years. It became a footnote, a tragic story that people would mention when discussing unsolved mysteries or the dangers of witness protection failures. But for the people of Millbrook, the case never really faded. It became part of the town's identity, a shared trauma that marked a before and after in the community's history. The Patterson property changed hands several times over the decades. The first buyers were a young couple from Portland, the Hendersons, who got the place for a song in 1990. They knew the history, of course. Everyone knew the history, but they needed the space, and the property was priced well below market value. They lived there for 10 years, raised 2 children in that house, and reported nothing unusual. No strange sounds, no ghostly visitations, no mysterious cold spots or unexplained phenomena. In 2000, the Hendersons sold to the Marcus family, who stayed for 8 years. Then the Rodriguezes owned it briefly from 2008 to 2013. Each family knew they were living in the house where the Patterson tragedy had unfolded, but none of them suspected that they were literally living on top of the answer to Millbrook's greatest mystery. The property acquired a reputation over the years. Teenagers dared each other to sneak onto the grounds at night. Local ghost story enthusiasts claimed the house was haunted by the spirits of the missing children. In 2012, a paranormal investigation team got permission from the then owners to spend a night in the house. They claimed to hear children's voices coming from beneath the floor of the master bedroom, but their evidence was dismissed as wishful thinking and suggestive interpretation of random sounds. How tragically ironic that assessment would prove to be. Sheriff Thomas Davies never stopped thinking about the Patterson case. Even after he retired in 2005, he would periodically visit the property, walk the grounds, and search for something, anything, that might have been missed. His daughter, Jennifer Davies, would later recall that her father became somewhat obsessed with the case in his final years. He would say, "Those children are still here, Jenny. I know it. They never left this property," Jennifer said in an interview in 2024 after the discovery. He'd studied the case files hundreds of times. He knew every K9 track, every search grid, every theory. And he kept coming back to one thing. The dogs lost the scent at the property line. Not in the woods, not at the road. Right at the property line, as if the children had just vanished into thin air. Dad said that meant they never left. They were still there, somewhere. He just couldn't figure out where. Thomas Davies died in 2018, carrying his obsession to the grave. According to his daughter, his final coherent words before he passed were about the Patterson children. "Tell them to dig deeper," he'd whispered. "Tell them to dig deeper." At the time, no one understood what he meant. The case was featured on Unsolved Mysteries in 1989, leading to a flood of tips that all led nowhere. It was revisited in 2010 by a true crime podcast that examined the witness protection angle and Vincent Caruso's possible involvement. That, too, generated renewed interest, but no breakthroughs. Caruso himself died in federal prison in 1993, taking whatever he knew about Linda Morrison's family to his grave. Over the years, various theories continued to circulate. Some people believed the children had been sold into human trafficking, a horrifying possibility that law enforcement investigated thoroughly but could never substantiate. Others thought the children had been killed and their bodies disposed of in the vast Oregon wilderness, perhaps weighted down in a lake or buried in a remote location. A few optimists held onto the hope that the children had been sent away to live with someone Robert and Linda trusted, and were out there somewhere, alive and unaware of the search for them. But as the years passed, even the optimists began to accept the likelihood that Michael, Sarah, Danny, and Emma Patterson were dead. The question was just where, how, and why. By 2015, the property was abandoned again. The last owners, a family named Chun, had bought it as an investment property but never moved in. They'd planned to renovate and flip it, but the renovation costs exceeded their budget, and the property's dark history made it difficult to sell. It sat empty, slowly deteriorating, becoming an eyesore on the edge of Millbrook. In 2020, the property was condemned. The house was structurally unsound, the roof was caving in, and it had become a hazard. The town council debated what to do with it for several years. Finally, in 2023, a developer proposed purchasing the land and building a small shopping center, something Millbrook desperately needed, as the town had experienced modest growth over the years, but lacked modern retail infrastructure. The proposal passed, the purchase was finalized, and demolition was scheduled for March 2024. A crew was hired. Jake Mitchell, the foreman, was given the job of clearing the site. And on March 15, 2024, his excavator bit into earth that hadn't been disturbed since Robert Patterson had sealed it in 1986. Thomas Davies had been right all along. The children had never left. They'd been there the entire time, just 15 feet below the surface, waiting for someone to dig deeper. The excavation of the underground chamber took 3 days. Forensic teams worked slowly, methodically, treating the site like an archaeological dig. Every object was photographed in place, catalogued, removed with extreme care. What emerged was a time capsule of 1986, preserved in concrete and darkness. The chamber measured 12 feet by 20 feet, about the size of a large bedroom. The concrete walls were 2 feet thick, reinforced with rebar. The ceiling was equally robust, designed to bear enormous weight. Whoever built this structure had engineering knowledge and construction skill. They'd built it to last, to withstand pressure, to keep what was inside separate from the world above. The entrance was a reinforced steel door, accessed through a trapdoor in what had been the master bedroom floor. The entire mechanism had been carefully concealed. When the Pattersons' bed was in place, as it had been when Robert and Linda's bodies were found, it would have completely hidden the trapdoor. No one searching the room would have had any reason to move the heavy bed and roll back the carpet beneath it. Inside the chamber, the forensic team found the evidence of 4 young lives that had ended in the worst possible way. 4 beds, small and simple, made up with blankets that had long since deteriorated into moldy fragments. 4 sets of children's clothes, sized appropriately for a 15-year-old, a 12-year-old, a 9-year-old, and a 6-year-old. Toys, a baseball glove, a wooden truck, a stuffed rabbit, a set of colored pencils. These were personal items, things the children would have wanted with them. The shelving along the walls told a story of preparation. Canned goods, beans, soup, vegetables, fruit, all with purchase dates stamped from August and September 1986. Large water containers, the kind used for camping, still partially full after all these years. A portable toilet in one corner, basic and functional. Blankets, pillows, even a few books, children's novels and textbooks. And the ventilation system. This was perhaps the most telling element of the chamber's design. A shaft had been bored through the concrete ceiling, extending up through 20 feet of earth to the surface. It was narrow, just 6 inches in diameter, and it had been carefully disguised at the surface level by what appeared to have been a decorative planter. The shaft was fitted with a mechanical fan system, designed to pull fresh air into the chamber and expel stale air. But the system had failed. The fan mechanism had corroded, seized, stopped functioning. Without fresh air circulation, the chamber would have quickly filled with carbon dioxide from 4 children breathing in an enclosed space. The forensic team estimated that the ventilation system had failed within the first week, maybe even within the first few days. Michael, Sarah, Danny, and Emma Patterson had suffocated in the shelter their father had built to save them. The true horror of the discovery became apparent when investigators found the journals. Michael's journal was recovered from beside his bed, a simple spiral-bound notebook with a cover that had long since degraded. The pages inside were written in the careful handwriting of a 15-year-old boy trying to make sense of an incomprehensible situation. The first entry was dated October 14, 1986. The same day, the children disappeared. Dad woke us up really early this morning, before the sun came up. He and Mom were acting strange. Dad kept saying we needed to go somewhere safe for a while. When I asked him why, he said there were bad people looking for us, and we needed to hide. He showed us this room he'd built under the house. He said we'd only be down here for a little while, just until the bad people went away. Emma's scared. She wants Mom to stay with us, but Mom said she and Dad have to stay upstairs, so the bad people think we left. This doesn't make sense. I told Dad we should just call the police, but he got really upset and said the police can't help us. He said the bad people are too powerful. I don't understand what's happening. The entries continued, each one more desperate than the last. October 15th. We've been down here for a whole day. Dad brought us breakfast this morning through the trapdoor. He said we're being very brave. He said it won't be much longer. Mom came down at lunch. She was crying. She kept saying she was sorry, over and over. Sorry for what? I asked her when we could come out, and she said soon. But she wouldn't look at me when she said it. Danny is starting to complain that it's hard to breathe. I told him he's just scared and to take deep breaths, but actually I think he's right. The air down here feels thick. October 16th. Dad didn't come this morning. We heard sounds upstairs, people walking around, talking. Dad said there would be people searching for us, that we needed to stay quiet no matter what. We stayed so quiet. Emma didn't even cry, even though I could tell she wanted to. The people were up there for hours. I could hear them right above us, walking around. They were so close. I wanted to scream for help, but I remembered what Dad said about the bad people being powerful. What if these were the bad people? What if Dad was right and we need to hide? But why didn't Dad come bring us food? We ate some of the canned stuff on the shelves. Sarah opened a can of peaches. They were good, but Emma threw up after eating them. I think the air is making us sick. October 17th. No one came today. I heard sounds upstairs in the morning, but then nothing. It's getting really hard to breathe. Danny has a headache. Sarah does too. Emma just sleeps all the time now. I tried the door, but it's locked from the outside. Dad must have locked it to keep us safe. But Dad, if you can read this, we need to come out now. Please. I don't think the air machine is working right. Please, Dad. We need help. The entries became harder to read after that, both physically. The handwriting deteriorated, became shaky and irregular, and emotionally. Michael's final entry was barely legible. October 19th. Can't breathe. Emma won't wake up. I tried everything. Sarah is sleeping too. Danny is. I don't know. Dad, please. Mom, please. I don't want to die down here. I tried to be brave, like you said. I tried to keep everyone calm. But I think we're dying. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I couldn't protect them. Please come get us. Please. I love you. Tell. The entry ended there. Michael Patterson, 15 years old, had died trying to write a final message to parents who were already dead themselves, lying in a bed directly above him, having taken their own lives the same day they'd sealed their children in a tomb. Sarah's diary was also recovered, filled with drawings rather than words. She'd drawn pictures of the family before, happy scenes of picnics and birthdays. She'd drawn the interior of the chamber, showing her siblings in their beds. And in her final drawings, done with increasingly shaky hands, she'd drawn what she imagined was happening outside. In her mind, the bad people her father had warned about were literal monsters, dark figures with claws and sharp teeth. She'd drawn her parents fighting these monsters, protecting the house above while the children hid below. She'd drawn a picture of the family reunited, all of them together again, safe. She never knew that the real monsters were far more banal than her imagination suggested. The real monsters were grief and fear and desperation. The real monster was a father who loved his children so much that he destroyed them trying to save them. The full story came together when investigators found what Robert Patterson had hidden in a metal box, sealed and tucked into a hollowed-out space behind a loose concrete block in the chamber wall. Inside was a letter, written in Robert's steady handwriting, along with a collection of documents that finally explained everything. The letter was addressed to whoever find this. My name is Robert Patterson. If you're reading this, it means my plan failed, and my children are dead. I pray that's not the case. I pray they survived and were found and rescued. But if they didn't, if they're gone, then you deserve to know why I did what I did. My wife Linda is not who she claimed to be. Her real name is Linda Morrison. In 1973, she witnessed a murder committed by a man named Vincent Caruso. She was going to testify against him in federal court. The case was dismissed, but Caruso never forgot. In 1974, he killed Linda's entire family to punish her for cooperating with federal authorities. He burned down their house with everyone inside. Linda survived only because she wasn't there that night. She'd been staying with a friend. She knew Caruso would come for her next, so she ran. She created a new identity and disappeared. I met Linda in 1979 in Portland. She was working as a waitress under a false name. We fell in love. She eventually told me the truth about who she was and what she was running from. I told her it didn't matter. We got married, moved to Millbrook, started our life together. We had 4 beautiful children. For 6 years, we were happy. We were safe. We thought maybe Caruso had forgotten about her, or didn't care anymore, or had bigger problems to worry about. We were wrong. On October 10, 1986, a man came into my hardware store. He didn't buy anything. He just looked around, asked a few questions about how long I'd owned the place, whether I liked living in Millbrook. Before he left, he said something that made my blood run cold. He said, "Small towns are nice, aren't they? Good places to raise kids. Speaking of which, I heard you have 4 of them. Michael, Sarah, Danny, and Emma. Lovely names." He knew their names. This stranger knew my children's names. He left before I could respond, but I knew. Caruso had found us. After all these years, he'd found us. I went home and told Linda. We both knew what it meant. Caruso doesn't forgive. Caruso doesn't forget. And Caruso doesn't just kill the person who wronged him. He kills everyone they love. That's his reputation. That's his method. We had 4 days to figure out what to do. We couldn't go to the police. Caruso has people everywhere, connections in law enforcement, judges on his payroll. Witness protection was out. Linda had refused it once. And even if she hadn't, Caruso had proven he could find people who disappeared. Running again would just delay the inevitable. He'd find us. And when he did, he'd kill all of us. I had built the underground shelter 2 years earlier, in 1984. Not for this reason. I'd built it as a storm shelter, a safe room in case of emergencies. It was something to do with my hands, a project that gave me purpose. I'd reinforced it, added the ventilation system, made it comfortable. I'd even stocked it with supplies, just in case we ever needed to shelter there for a few days during a storm. And then I realized it could save our children. The plan was simple. Linda and I would die. We'd make it look like a suicide, a tragedy, a couple overwhelmed by some unnamed grief. Caruso's people would come, would search, would find 2 dead bodies, and would report back that the job was done. Meanwhile, our children would be safe in the shelter, hidden beneath the house. They'd have food, water, air. I'd set the ventilation system on a timer. It would run for 3 days, then shut off to conserve power. After 3 days, surely the police would have found the house, would be investigating, would be searching. I left clues, subtle ones that I thought investigators would find. The locked bedroom door from the inside would make them suspicious. They'd search thoroughly. They'd find the chamber. They'd find our children alive and safe, and they'd protect them from Caruso in ways that Linda and I never could. I installed timers for everything. The ventilation would run on cycles, on for 8 hours, off for 4, enough to keep the air fresh, but conserve the batteries. The door would automatically unlock after 72 hours, giving the children a way out if they weren't found. I'd set up lighting, heating, everything they'd need to survive for weeks if necessary, though I knew it wouldn't come to that. 3 days, maybe 4, and they'd be found. On the morning of October 14th, I woke our children before dawn. I told them about the bad people, about the danger, about the need to hide. I showed them the chamber. I promised them it would only be for a little while. I promised them they'd be safe. I hugged each of them and told them I loved them. Michael, my strong boy, trying so hard to be brave. Sarah, clutching her sketchbook. Danny, scared but trusting me. And Emma, my baby, asking when she could come back upstairs. Then I sealed them inside. I locked the door. I went upstairs with Linda. We took the pills. We drank the whiskey. We lay down in our bed together, holding hands, and we waited to die. Our last thoughts were of our children, safe below us, soon to be found and rescued. But something went wrong. I don't know what. The timers failed, or I miscalculated, or God is punishing me for the sin of suicide. If you're reading this, if my children are dead, then I failed them in the worst way possible. I tried to save them, and instead I killed them. Please know that we love them. Please know that everything we did because we thought it was the only way to protect them from a monster. Please know that Linda and I are burning in whatever hell awaits parents who murder their children, even accidentally, even with the best of intentions. And please, if there's any justice in the world, make sure Vincent Caruso pays for this. He may not have killed them himself, but they died because of him. They died because a good woman witnessed his evil and had the courage to try to stop it. They died because he couldn't let that go, couldn't forgive, couldn't show mercy. Michael, Sarah, Danny, Emma, if by some miracle you survived, if you're reading this as adults, please forgive us. Please know that we loved you more than life itself. That's why we died, so that you could live. I only hope to God that it worked. The letter was signed Robert Patterson, October 14th, 1986. Also in the metal box were the documents that corroborated everything Robert had written. Newspaper clippings about the Morrison family fire in Wisconsin. FBI reports on the Caruso case, which Linda had somehow obtained. Photos of Linda from before, when she was still Linda Morrison, young and smiling and unaware of the tragedy that would consume her entire family. And a receipt dated October 10th, 1986, from Patterson Hardware. A customer had purchased a small item, a box of nails. The customer had paid cash. The receipt showed no name. But on the back, in Robert's handwriting, were 5 words, he knows. God help us. When Detective Morrison revealed these findings to the public in April 2024, the reaction was a complex mix of emotions. Horror at what had happened. Sympathy for parents who'd made an impossible choice. Rage at Vincent Caruso, who'd created the circumstances that led to such desperation. And overwhelming grief for 4 children who died in darkness, scared and confused, never understanding why their parents had abandoned them. The case against Caruso was examined posthumously. He died in 1993, so he'd never face justice for his indirect role in the Patterson tragedy. But investigators confirmed that in October 1986, Caruso had indeed sent someone to Millbrook. Phone records showed calls from Caruso's known associates to Oregon in early October. Financial records showed payments to an enforcer who traveled to the Pacific Northwest that month. Caruso had found Linda. The man who'd walked into Robert's hardware store had been one of Caruso's people, delivering a message, making his presence known. And that message had triggered a series of events that led to 6 deaths, 4 children, 2 parents, all destroyed by fear and love and desperation. The funeral for Michael, Sarah, Danny, and Emma Patterson was held on April 20th, 2024, 38 years to the day after they were last seen alive. Millbrook came to a standstill. Every business closed. Every school dismissed early. More than 2,000 people attended the service at Millbrook Community Church, with hundreds more standing outside, unable to fit in the building. The caskets were small, white, covered in flowers. For children who'd been 15, 12, 9, and 6 in 1986 were finally laid to rest in 2024. They were buried beside their parents in Millbrook Cemetery, a decision made by the town council after significant debate. Some argued that Robert and Linda didn't deserve to lie beside the children they'd killed. Others countered that they'd been victims too, driven to desperate measures by an evil beyond their control. In the end, the family was reunited in death as they'd been in life. The headstone, paid for by donations from around the country, was simple and heartbreaking. The Patterson family: Robert, 1944 to 1986, Linda, 1947 to 1986, Michael, 1971 to 1986, Sarah, 1974 to 1986, Daniel, 1977 to 1986, Emma, 1980 to 1986. Together again. Sheriff Davies' daughter, Jennifer, spoke at the funeral. She held her father's old case file, the one he'd maintained for decades, the one he'd never been able to close. My father spent 32 years in law enforcement, and the Patterson case haunted him until the day he died, she said, her voice strong despite the tears in her eyes. He knew those children were still on that property. He knew they'd never left. In his final hours, he told me to tell investigators to dig deeper. He meant it literally, though none of us understood at the time. Today, as we lay these four beautiful souls to rest, I want everyone to know that Tom Davies never gave up on them. He never stopped searching. And in a way, he was here when they were found, guiding us still. The impact of the Patterson case extended far beyond Millbrook. It became a case study in witness protection failures, in the limits of parental decision-making in extreme circumstances, in the unintended consequences of trying to protect those we love. Law schools debated whether Robert and Linda's actions constituted murder or a tragic accident. Ethics classes discussed the moral implications of their choice. Psychology programs examined the trauma and decision-making processes that could lead parents to such desperate measures. The Witness Protection Program underwent significant reforms, partially in response to the Patterson case. New protocols were implemented to ensure that witnesses who declined protection were still monitored and supported, that threats were taken seriously and acted upon swiftly. Building codes in Oregon and several other states were updated to require permits for any underground construction, with mandatory inspections and documentation. The idea was to prevent anyone else from being able to build and seal a chamber like Robert Patterson's without oversight. And in Millbrook itself, the Patterson property was transformed. Instead of the planned shopping center, the town council voted to create Patterson Memorial Park. 20 acres of green space, playgrounds, walking trails, and a memorial garden. At the center of the park stands a sculpture of 4 children playing, frozen in a moment of joy. Beneath it, a plaque tells their story, ensuring that Michael, Sarah, Danny, and Emma Patterson will never be forgotten. Detective Sarah Morrison retired from the state police in 2025, a year after the case was closed. In her final interview before retirement, she was asked what she'd learned from the Patterson investigation. "I learned that evil doesn't always look like evil," she said. Vincent Caruso was evil. He killed to maintain power, to send messages, to terrorize. But Robert and Linda Patterson loved their children. They weren't evil. They were desperate and terrified, and they made a catastrophic mistake. The real lesson isn't that parents can be monsters. It's that monsters can push good people to do monstrous things. And that's perhaps the saddest truth of all. The Patterson case file, all 40,000 pages of it accumulated over 38 years, is now housed in the Oregon State Archives. Researchers, students, and true crime enthusiasts can request access, though they must go through a rigorous approval process. The file contains everything: the original missing persons reports, the search documentation, the investigation into Robert and Linda's backgrounds, the 2024 discovery, the forensic reports, the journals, Robert's letter, every piece of evidence that tells this tragic story. And in that file, in a protective sleeve, is one last piece of evidence that wasn't released to the public initially, but was eventually made available with the rest of the case materials. It's a drawing done by Sarah Patterson during her final days in the chamber. It shows a house, their house, with the sun shining and flowers blooming. In the yard, for children play, while 2 adults watch from the porch, smiling. At the bottom of the drawing, in Sarah's careful 12-year-old handwriting, are 4 words that sum up everything the Patterson children wanted, everything they hoped for, everything they died waiting for. When we come home. For siblings vanished in 1986. For 38 years, their disappearance remained one of Oregon's greatest mysteries. In 2024, the truth finally emerged from the earth, buried 15 feet beneath the house they called home. The discovery didn't bring the children back. It couldn't undo the tragedy or erase the decades of grief and unanswered questions. But it did bring closure to a community that had never stopped searching, never stopped hoping, never stopped mourning. Michael Patterson would be 53 years old today. Sarah would be 50. Danny would be 47. Emma would be 44. They might have had families of their own, careers, dreams fulfilled, lives lived. Instead, they remain forever frozen at 15, 12, 9, and 6, for children who deserve to grow up, whose lives were cut short not by a monster with a knife or a gun, but by circumstances beyond their control and decisions made by parents who love them. The Patterson case reminds us that truth, no matter how long it takes to emerge, eventually finds its way to the light. It reminds us that the people we've lost deserve to be remembered, their stories told, their lives honored. And it reminds us that sometimes the most dangerous thing in the world isn't hatred or violence or evil intent. It's fear mixed with love, mixed with desperation, creating a toxic combination that destroys everything it touches. Michael, Sarah, Danny, and Emma Patterson are home now. They rest in Millbrook Cemetery, their names etched in stone, their story known, their memory preserved. The mystery of what happened to them has been solved. The truth, terrible as it is, has been revealed. And in the end, that's all we can do for them. Tell their story, remember their names, and ensure that the tragedy that consumed the Patterson family is never forgotten. Rest in peace, Michael. Rest in peace, Sarah. Rest in peace, Danny. Rest in peace, Emma. You're home now. Finally, you're home. This is Ultimate Crime Stories. If this case moved you, if it made you think, if it reminded you why we search for truth no matter how painful it might be, then please subscribe to our channel. We bring you stories that matter, cases that deserve to be remembered, truths that need to be told. Hit that subscribe button, ring the notification bell, and join us as we continue to explore the darkest corners of human nature and the brightest examples of those who never give up searching for answers. Thank you for listening. Until next time, remember, the truth is always out there, waiting to be discovered.